every action has a reaction or a consequence, if you want to call it that. Some people are asking, for example, about our country. How is it possible that we're at this place? Must everything happen this way? And I'd say, well, God has a plan, but the fruit of what has happened just in this country alone since its inception should give people an indicator that nothing just happens by itself. By that I mean, if you think about the founding of this country, where people were to some degree devout. The people that came here, for example, on the Mayflower, sang hymns out of the Bible. And even if you want to talk about our founding fathers, many of them had very interesting takes on the Bible. I'm talking about somebody like Jefferson, right, who didn't like certain things, so he cut out what he didn't like out of the Bible, made his own. Okay. But a falling away has consequences. Now, luckily, we serve an amazing, merciful God. So God looks on the heart of the individual. We could be, for better words, being punished for even a country. If you think about it biblically, as the people moved as a group, as a nation, as a people, in disobedience, they reaped consequences, right? Consequences of disobedience. So I'm going to take you on a very, we'll call it long-winded trail of something that will explain something else. And in the process, we're going to do a little bit of winding through the scriptures. So don't think I'm lost, even though we're going to appear to be all over the place. There's actually a very specific trajectory I want to take you on. So most of the people in the sound of my voice know who the biblical personage of Abraham is. I would say almost everybody does. Maybe there are newer people in this congregation or in the sound of my voice who do not know who Lot is. Lot was Abraham's nephew who traveled with Abraham from Ur of Chaldees. In fact, Abraham's father, mother, they all traveled together. And then we read that Abraham and Lot decided to part ways. They eventually, as they traveled together, their livestock is so much that it says their herdsmen are fighting, and they decide they're going to split up. So Abraham says to Lot, you pick first, right? They're standing at basically at a certain place in the Bible. You pick first. And Lot picks the well-watered plains of Jordan. I always like to read that passage and smile because it reminds me that if you give people a chance to choose, in their greed, they will probably take what they think is the better part. So Lot right away reveals he is self-serving, greedy. He's just a bunch of stuff, okay, in his decision. But God's going to deal with that in a very interesting way. So Lot chooses the fertile plain of the Jordan River, and eventually he settles in Sodom. Interesting choice, right? Sodom, as you know, is eventually destroyed because of its wickedness. And Lot, his wife, and his daughters are urged to flee the city. Now, if you know the story, just keep the story in your brain because I'm going to make some connections to it in just a second. Lot leaves the city with his two daughters and his wife, and if you remember, they're not to look back, and she does. And there's a lesson there. For all you salty ones out there, there's a lesson. God really actually does want us to obey his word. This is not obedience like we teach a dog. This is, as really brilliantly Dr. Scott explained, running to the voice of the sayer, listening and going in that direction, not away from it, is the best way to explain that without people cringing at the word obedience. So We know that his wife did not listen. And so now we have the two daughters and Lot, and they believe, the two daughters believe, that all of humanity's been destroyed. So they decide they're going to take matters into their own hands. In consecutive nights, they get Lot drunk, they take turns sleeping with him, and they conceive children by him. That's a whole interesting subject, which I don't want to get into, but it's interesting nonetheless, of how that all happened. If you can understand what may or may not have been functioning, it's kind of weird, but anyway, we'll leave that one alone. Don't touch that one. But they thought that they were preserving humanity by taking matters into their own hands, all right? And I think the most important takeaway is going to be that this evil, incestuous act resulted in the birth of two people. Well, at first it's two children, Moab and Ben-Ammi. And these will become two nations known to us as the Moabites and the Ammonites. Now, before you get too judgmental of the daughters of Lot for what they did, it's kind of weird. You know, never once do they pray and say, Lord, what should we do? You're not reading that they're asking for guidance. They just take matters into their own hands, literally. So if you remember, Lot was willing to offer up his daughters to these evil people in Sodom. So don't just go, oh, those daughters are disgusting, because the dad was disgusting. And you could say, well, it was customary to do this instead of that. It's still disgusting that he would have offered up his daughters to be raped or molested or whatever else. So don't be so critical of them, because they all had a DNA problem, okay? Something in the brain that wasn't right. So the Moabites then, you're gonna see them every time you're reading the Old Testament, the Moabites and the Ammonites. You're going to encounter them a lot. The Moabites being related to Abraham, often in conflict, and when we encounter them, they are a Semitic people, but they are pagan, okay? They are not worshiping Yahweh. They are a Semitic stock, but pagan. They worshipped Chemosh, Canaanite deity associated with war, destruction, and archaeological evidence around Chemosh suggests they practiced human sacrifice, especially child sacrifice. That was very common. Now, if we read some of the record, we could just immediately say, oh, those people, they were bad and they were terrible. But if you read, there's records that tell us and give us insight into some of these, we'll call them early encounters. So the first one that I want us to look at is in 1 Samuel, because it's kind of telling. It's 1 Samuel and 22. Very interesting. So I could tell you how evil the Moabites and the Ammonites are, because for the most part, when we encounter them, they're evil, they're making trouble. But this gives you an idea where I've jumped from Abraham's time all the way to David's time, just to give you some, speed this up. I could have taken more time, I don't want to. So we have David, who basically will gather up, he goes and takes his parents, his mother and father. Verse 3 of 1 Samuel 22 says, David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you, till I know what God will do for me. And he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt all the while that David was in the hold. So that gives you an idea that no matter what you're going to read, there were some moments of goodness on the part of the Moabite people, okay? It's not all gloom and doom, it's not all bad, but there are more negatives than positives. So the first thing that I want to point out in kind of unfolding this is that we tend to read about these people and we just gloss over them. We don't necessarily take the time to find out who they were, where they came from, and why they ended up doing some of the practices that they did, which becomes important for our understanding. So the first thing I want to point out to you is that although most of this is going to be negative, just telling you up front, There's pockets of goodness, especially in the line of Moab. We've got a couple of instances of goodness. But let me make sure that we're all starting in the same place. Maybe the first point that I want to take note of is that everything kind of goes south when people in the Bible, which then after the Bible comes to us, take matters into their own hands to solve problems, okay? So the daughters of Lot, for example, took matters into their own hands, thinking that they never asked God, they just did what they did, and that brought forth an incestuous evil seed. And the argument somebody might make will be, well, but wasn't there incest earlier with the first family? And how did they reproduce? Because if there were no people before Adam and Eve, well, God somehow made that okay. So just kind of, don't ask me because I'm not God, but somehow that was okay with God, somehow this is not. So just kind of note to self that when people take matters into their own hands, there are consequences. So, for example, the consequences of the children of Israel making a golden calf to worship, taking matters into their own hands because they were impatient to wait for Moses to come down from the mount. You've got Abraham and Hagar, impatient and taking matters into their own hand when God clearly said he promised them a child, but they couldn't possibly wait on God, so they took matters into their own hands, and Abraham and Hagar produced Ishmael instead of waiting on the child of promise, Isaac, all right? And Saul offering sacrifices prematurely instead of waiting. So the Bible kind of shows us a record when people start to do things on their own and not wait on God's word or go according to what God said, there are consequences. So I'll come back to this probably at the close of my message, but when we look at even our lives, our country, things that are current, don't think they just happen because, somebody's got bad luck. There are consequences to everything. And we as believers, as faithers, have to be mindful of that. So let me get back into talking about, I'm looking at the Moabites first, okay? So I just pointed out something really nice. David entrusts his parents to be safeguarded by the king of Moab. And probably the most famous Moabite in the Bible is Ruth, the book that bears her name. And what I find unbelievable about Ruth is that it shows you that even though this line of incest, this line of not waiting on God, not asking God, that God could still enter in. That's the beautiful part that gives us all hope, right? That God could still enter into that line and raise up a woman who, as I said, is memorialized in a small book in the Old Testament bearing her name, Ruth. But after her husband died, she remained loyal to her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. And she says something so beautiful. Basically, she says, where you go, I'll go. And the God that you worship is my God. And trust me, God had to have heard her words because he honored her faith. And she is unlike any other Moabite in the book, all right? In fact, God was so gracious for her quarter turn of wanting to follow Naomi and stay the course that he lets her meet Boaz, and eventually they get married. And that is the line descending to Christ. So when you think about it, God, this is why I rail against people saying the Bible's not inclusive and it excludes people. No. Here's a woman who came from a lineage of incest, who should have been discarded, and yet God graciously let her be woven into the tapestry that makes up the genealogy leading down to Christ. This is actually David's, I believe, great-grandmother. So it tells you God, when he sees just a little quarter turn, not even a full turn, that means something to him. So that should bring hope to the people out there that say, well, what hope is there for me? Well, just take a little page out of what I just said, and it's pretty amazing. But the point here is that there's a lot said about Moab and the Moabites in the negative. The prophet Jeremiah predicted judgment on them for their pride and their actions. One of their most famed kings was Mesha. Now, I know there's a bunch of people out there that listen, and they always think I say things and, no, what's that? Well, for those of you who need something extra, there is a stele called the Mesha stele. It dates to the 9th century, and it's probably one of many secular, non-biblical references to Yahweh, to the people, the children of Israel, and the events that unfolded in the Bible. That's why I say, the whatever you take out of the earth doesn't lie, right? But very interesting. The stele chronicles the rebellion against the kingdom of Israel in the 9th century, and inscriptions detail King Mesha's victory over Israel and attributing them to the Moabite deity Chemosh. In case somebody says this is all made up. No, it's not. It's all part of an important history. Now, on the other side, so I just talked to you about one of the lines of the children of incest, that's Moab and the Moabites. Then there is the other side of this, Ammon, or the child who's called Ben-Ami, whose descendants will be known to us as the children of Ammon or the Ammonites. And they have their own history, and their history is kind of interesting. And I would say important because it paints a picture of why acts of disobedience before God are not forgotten. So, we have the children of Israel. They are being led out of Egypt. And here are the children of Ammon, the Ammonites. They refuse to let the children of Israel pass. They won't let them pass. They won't give them bread. They won't give them water. God did not forget that. So just kind of put that in as a beginning point. What an introduction to a people. And this God will definitively remember. So we have a people that, if you think about it, where Lot settled, one part of that family is going to settle as far north as the Jabbok River and as far south as the hills of Edom. And years later, if you're following, I'm a little bit out of sequence, but years later, after the children of Israel come out of Egypt and they finally enter into Canaan, you pass that period, you're going to encounter them again in the book of Judges. And these Ammonites never go away. They just keep reoccurring. You think that they've been dealt with, and then they come back. And wait, there's more. They're like the cockroaches of the Bible, okay? I'm just going to say it like that. So, kind of interesting. When you get to the period of the Judges, you have Jephthah, the Gileadite, and in that passage referring to Jephthah, it came to pass that at that time the children of Ammon made war against Israel. And Jephthah the Gileadite was basically leader or head. And it is in connection to the Ammonites making war against the children of Israel that Jephthah vows a vow that would cost him dearly, would cost him his daughter. But I want you to just understand, it's almost like it's a domino effect. Everything is a domino effect here. So we have Jephthah fighting the Ammonites, fought and overcame and overtook them, and they were subdued, not annihilated, but subdued. And as I said, it came at a terrible price. Later on, we see David crushing the Ammonites when the kingdom eventually splits and is divided later. In the north and the south, we're going to read about the kings now who will either be interfacing, paying tribute, or, interestingly enough, starting to take on these pagan gods that both Moabites and Ammonites worship. So the Moabites, their god was Chemosh. The Ammonites, their god or their deity that they prayed to or made offerings to, Molech Moloch or Milcom, same name. And if you are curious, because a lot of people have asked me, this is probably the weirdest way to answer these biblical questions of people. What about Moloch? Well, I'm trying to explain to you, there's a very clear pathway to kind of understand how God lays this out, to understand why these gods were so bad or viewed as so bad, and how people coming from the consequences of incest basically couldn't see their practices as evil. So it's almost like evil begets more evil, and every once in a while there'll be a little light of goodness somewhere, but that doesn't last long. So for example, we have in the accession of Jeroboam II of Israel's reign in the north, and Uzziah, who reigned Judah in the south, about 785 BC, ushered in a period of prosperity and expansion of both upper and lower kingdoms. Uzziah reigned until the Philistines and all that territory, they came and they basically did obeisance. The Ammonites bring incredible gifts. And we start to see something interesting. These Ammonites are now prosperous and wealthy. How does this happen? Well, they're a little bit like mafioso. They're operating the trade route, that is the Transjordan area where people have to come through. So they enrich themselves by, well, you figure it out yourself. And we see them gaining traction with the kings of the north and the south, because they're arriving and they're bearing great gifts. And of course, what political leader isn't enthralled to receive bribes and gifts, right? Don't think that our politicians invented it. It's right here in the Bible. It goes way back. So all of this goes good until the time of Tiglath-Pileser, who deposed the king of Israel and made Hoshea, the king, basically a vassal to Assyrian. At the same time that Assyria is dominating and invading, all the Transjordan states would pay tribute. And somehow we know that these Ammonites are involved. So wherever there was money going on, these people are there. They're either taking, stealing, whatever they're doing. And that's all I can tell you about that. They somehow provided materials for the palace at Nineveh. And if you've ever seen pictures of the palace or read descriptions of the palace, that's a whole lot of gold. That's a whole lot of stuff, which means they were prolifically robbing people. That's kind of what that translates to. So if you take all of the information I've just put out there and then add to it, by the time the people come back from Babylonian captivity, we're in the book of Nehemiah, you can tell that the Ammonites have not been eradicated. Why? Because you all remember a person named Sanballat in the book of Nehemiah and Ezra, Sanballat? Well, Tobiah is Tobiah the Ammonite. Sanballat the Honorite. So they're not eradicated. They're still around. And somehow, I think this is very interesting, because we're constantly reading that God is saying, wipe him out, get rid of him, and battles are fought, and they're never eradicated. That's why I said like cockroaches, right? There are some interesting prophecies about these people. And so, for example, in Isaiah 11, there is a prophecy that tells us, it's a future prophecy, that God will bring a remnant of Ammon under the Messiah's rule. So you have to ask, and you may be asking, who are the Ammonites today, because they haven't been wiped out, and where do they come from? And I'll get to that in a minute. If you know your geography, you might know a place named Rabbah. If you know where that is. If you don't, I'll tell you towards the end of the message. But it's just interesting to say that they were never wiped out. And why am I trying to show you this? Because these are not just descendants of incest that kind of spilled over, and it just generation after generation, the evil keeps going. God was very clear about something. There's a record in Deuteronomy, and that record talks about if they should not be allowed. It's a special word just for these people. All right. Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3 says, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever." That's pretty wild. Now, I want you to wrap your mind around two things. I'm trying to point out that every action has consequences, and at the same time, recognize that even if you are one of those people that's taken matters into your own hands, God can be merciful. Just look at Ruth, who is a prime example of turning to God and keeping God in your heart, and God can show mercy even in the face of disobedience. So, but he says here, "Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way when you came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee. Nevertheless, the Lord thy God would not hearken unto Balaam, but the Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee." So think about that. And there's kind of a two-sided message going on here. Now, why am I putting all this out here? Because there's a really strange passage. Everything I just said, that is backdrop. Because you wouldn't understand or make a connection between everything I've just said and a passage in Leviticus, which, again, if you don't know, you'd say, well, where does this come from? So Leviticus 18. If you have a Bible like mine, and I tell you I don't care for the headers, the bold headers, but if you have a Bible like mine, Leviticus 18 says, "Forbidden sexual practices." Now remember, we've only read, if you're reading the Bible in order, you would have only read Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. So you would have only known very, very little about the Ammonites. You would have known where they came from because they are out of Lot's daughters, Moab and Ammon. But you would not connect these thoughts. So there's a whole chapter that is on forbidden sexual practices. And as you read through it, very, very clearly, without going into the detail, you're not to look at the nakedness of your father, your mother, your sister, your brother, your sons, your daughter. Just there's a whole list of things. And then it goes on to talk about even to not look at your neighbor's wife, all of these things, all right? And then when you keep reading, you get to verse 21. "And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord." Now, if you didn't know why that was in there, you might read that and say, that's kind of out of place, right? The whole passage is dealing with sexual no-nos, and then right there it says, well, now I want you to start connecting some dots. And again, it's not always, the Bible doesn't, it's not God's responsibility to go A, B, C. Sometimes you have to connect the dots, which is why I'm taking you on this big journey to show you something. This sits in the chapter of forbidden sexual practices because it's a throwback to essentially warning of what the children of Lot did. Lot's dealing with that whole circumstance in Sodom, and it's all tied together. It's as though God is saying, I'm not even going to take the time to elaborate it for you, but I'm just going to put it there. And yes, the practice was to offer their children to this god called Molech, which, strangely enough, the children of Israel seem to have an affinity for bulls and cows. And there's no error in my mind that this undoubtedly came from while they were in Egypt. There's this morphing of what we see and what we understand. So this Molech might have had horns like a bull, had a upper body, almost bull-like, with human hands outstretched, and a base where they would put coals and whatever elements they would burn to heat it up, and then they would place a child as a sacrifice, where the extended arms would be so hot it would just basically burn the child alive, while priests, pagan priests, would bang drums to cancel the noise of the child crying, okay? It's a terrible thing. But ask yourself, why is it nestled in this chapter? And it'll give you understanding that God connected this whole passage to sexual immorality and forbidden practices, which take you back to Genesis 19. And beyond that, by the way, Sodom and Gomorrah is attached essentially, and then the daughters of Lot. So it's like saying the first act of disobedience, the first act of taking matters into your own hands led to a whole unfolding, an avalanche, that were there other Canaanite deities being worshipped that bore similar characteristic traits, or that they offered votive or human sacrifices to? Absolutely. But God mentions this one right here. And there's layers to this that I could keep peeling back. But the most interesting thing is, if you look at this, again, there's all these pseudo things. So Moloch, if you looked in the Hebrew, it would look something like this. And if you have studied with me, you know that that is melech, king. Can also mean shame. There's other meanings to it. So it's almost like this name was stolen and then morphed to mean something else. And whether it's shame, guilt, or king, I can't say to you, because it was not originally written in Hebrew, but those are the letters from the Hebrew that I take from that name. So it's important to understand God placed that just randomly right there. No, not at all. Against sexual practices, telling the people, "Thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God, for I am the Lord." Then read the next verse. "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, is abomination." So nestled right in there, if you didn't understand the why, I hope you do now. It links you back to almost God saying, you know where this came from? This came from back there, from immoral sexual practices that then, almost like some evil that overtook, that just spawned down and produced these, we'll call them practices of evil. So when we talk about these things, I can tell you, people have asked me this question so many times. We know that Molech, Milcom, they're associated with Ammon and the Ammonites directly. As I said, they were also part of an umbrella group of the Canaanites, which encompass all of these ites, the Amorites, the Girgasites, the Hivites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, yes, the Perizzites, Sidonians. And so they all worshipped some form of Molech or Milcom. And did they all offer their children? It's very difficult to say, but it seems like it was a common practice. So then you end up reading passages like what is in Deuteronomy 12, and it kind of tells you why now. Why was God warning the people? "When the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whither thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them, and dwellest in their land, take heed to thyself that thou not be snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before thee. And that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God, for every abomination to the Lord, which he hateth, have they done unto their gods, even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. What things soever I command you, observe it to do. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it." So it's God was warning. And again, don't just think about this in terms of what God was warning the children of Israel. When you go into the land, this is why God was saying, when you go into the land, wipe it clean. Because he knew what was in the heart of the people, to be easily swept up to serving other gods. And you might say, well, you know, these were uneducated people, and they were maybe not knowing, and they didn't understand. Okay, well then you need to take a second look, because it doesn't just affect the children of Israel entering into a land. It will affect the entirety of this history, this portion of history, when you understand because they didn't eradicate, because they didn't listen, because they didn't obey. And now you fast forward to the time of Solomon. And it specifically says in the chapter that speaks of how Solomon's heart was led away, that he got caught up, fell away from following God, and he chose to surround himself with Moabites and Ammonites and Edomites. And it says, basically, God very specifically warned him as he warned the children of Israel. And this is why I'm saying to you, a lot of times we read or we hear things and we think it's for somebody else. And this lesson has so many levels to it. We could probe the depths of Moloch and ask ourselves why. But probably there's never going to be a rational why when you're talking about demonic forces at work. You can't make sense of what the devil does or makes people do or that people lend themselves to do. However, you could say, well, didn't Solomon know better? I mean, after all, he did build a house for God, right? That was what he was permitted to do. David wanted to do it, and God said, no, your hands are too bloody. But Solomon got to build the house, and it was not enough for him to stay focused on God and God's way and God's word. And clearly we see in 1 Kings 11, then Solomon did build a high place for Shemosh, the god of the Moabites, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. He took the time to build and construct these things for the purpose, obviously, of what would become a practice taken up by many of the people who were following or marginally following Yahweh. So when people say, how did this happen? I just told you. Now there is a record. It's interesting because it's papered through the Bible. You cannot escape this record. So if you read in Psalm 106 and verse 34, it says, they did not destroy the nations concerning whom the Lord commanded them, but were mingled among the heathen and learned their works and served their idols, which were a snare unto them. Yea, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters unto devils, and shed innocent blood, even the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed unto the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with blood. Thus were they defiled with their own works, and went a-whoring with their own inventions. It's very interesting to me that we read these passages and we don't get a check in our hearts and in our minds that no, God is not asking us to do certain things or not do certain things, but there are things that are said clearly that say, if we are actually listening and trying to follow, these are wonderful lessons to show that somehow getting caught up in what somebody else is doing will never bear fruit in any good way. And I could make a modern application to this right now, and I think I will, because I've got a little bit of time to do it. You can make a modern application to this to say people getting caught up in other worship practices who are not reading this book, they're not studying this book. And I know this is quite a controversy when I say this, but you've got pastors, forget about parishioners, you've got pastors that are on this bandwagon to hoist Israel above Jesus Christ, while many people are being misled because it's their spiritual leaders leading them on this journey. And how easy is that? Just read the Bible to see how easy it is to be led astray. And don't think that you might think, well, this is the Bible, but it's happening today. And if you can't see the parallels, no, people are not maybe burning their children in fire, but they're setting up their children to basically walk through the fire of hell without telling them that these ideologies and these dogmas, and I don't care which branch of the church you want to get them from, are not from God. They never were from God. And if anybody's reading the word, you could see it, read it, know it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. So it's really important to see when we say these people learned and served the idols. And we tend to think, well, we don't have that today. Oh, yes, we do. We're plagued by it. We're plagued by it everywhere we look. So don't just think this is something archaic we don't have to deal with. We do. Now, what's interesting is if you keep reading about these people, you're going to find a couple of things come up. One of them is that Jeremiah will mention them explicitly. Ezekiel will prophesy and refer to the abomination of child sacrifice in the kingdom of Judah. That's Ezekiel 16. And that God basically instructed them. So, you might say, well, why did God say, go into the land and wipe it clean and don't commingle yourself with other people? There was a reason for it. Modern Judaism, for example, not unlike, it's very similar to Christianity like this. People say, I want to meet someone who's of my own faith. But if you're practicing it, that's one thing. If you're that faith in name only, I don't even know why you'd bother. Because you're already burdened down with things that have nothing to do with God, just going through the motions of a social group, if you want to call it that. So God was trying to warn the people. No one was listening, obviously, because it became so pervasive. And we then get a little indication of something. It was in the time of King Josiah, who destroyed Topheth in the valley of Hinnom to prevent it from being used for sacrificing children. That's in 2 Kings 23. The obvious references made by Jeremiah and Ezekiel reveal that the high places, what are called Topheth, is a name for a place where worshiping Moloch and the acts of these insidious practices happened. So the Topheth in the valley of Hinnom was likely the place of worship established by Solomon in his day. And we have the Greek word Gehenna, which comes from the Hebrew Ben Hinnom, referred to as the Valley of Hinnom because of the terrible and horrific acts committed there in the Valley of Hinnom. The word Gehenna aligns with it, the burning, human sacrifice, the burning, evil, kind of the perpetual fires, if you want to call it that. And you might ask, well, was this practice done by other people in other places? And this is what's interesting. We have very little archaeological evidence of Chemosh. We've got the mention of it on some inscriptions. We have very little to go on except when you get to Carthage, which is completely outside of what I'm discussing. And you can look this up for yourself. There is a historian by the name of Clitarchus, and he wrote, quote, Phoenicians and above all Carthaginians worship Kronos, who is going to be the exact same deity as Molech in this particular reference. If they wish to accomplish something big, then they devote a child of theirs, and in the case of success, sacrifice it to the god. There is a bronze statue of Kronos among them, which stands upright with open arms, the palms of the hands facing upwards. This imagery is the equivalent of Moloch or Molech. And there's still great debate, by the way. No two scholars are in agreement over this, but the idea is that it was practiced primarily by the Canaanites, and because of commingling and other elements, it got joined in, and people were practicing this most terrible act. So this is why this is a long-winded way to get to where I wanted to go. You get to the New Testament. Right before Stephen is stoned in the book of Acts, I believe it's in the 7th chapter, I think it's in the 43rd or some verse somewhere there, where Stephen is delivering his sermon, his speech before they stone him. And he brings up, who is he talking to? The religious people of his day who are full of zeal, and they want to eradicate those people who are followers of Christ. And he brings up this one statement of offering to the god of Molech. And a lot of people read that and they either conflate or they don't understand what he was saying to them at that time. If you read the whole passage, is how God kept giving them chances to obey, to listen, and the whole time they did what was right in their own eyes. They acted and they did evil just based on what they wanted to do with blatant disregard, but yet they still put a halo around everything, calling it their faith or their religion. And this is why, if you really take a second read of Stephen's sermon, you realize that he was, without saying it, he was saying, you bunch of hypocrites, bunch of lying hypocrites. That's what he was saying in bringing this out. So wait a minute. Stephen, he's bad because he's following this crucified and risen Messiah. Yet you're going to stone him for saying these things while you, Stephen's talking to them, is basically calling out their evil. If you read his whole sermon and read it in those eyes, with those eyes, you recognize what he was calling out. And it is no different when I say this, except for the child sacrifice part, it is no different than what goes on today. The church has reinvented itself over time. So even now, when I say this to you, the church, by virtue of its offering of relics to venerate, or certain things that people do when they come into a church, whether it's kissing an icon or lighting a candle, it all gets caught up in the same baggage. God is interested in, that's why I brought up Ruth. God is interested in what's in the heart. So even a child of incest to the 10th generation, as Deuteronomy describes, could be set free if the heart was turned back to God, which she did. And I think what I'm saying to all of us here is it's interesting to understand where these things came from, where false worship comes out of. There's always a start to something. You know, we talk about this. Christmas is coming up, and people will have great debates over should we celebrate the birth of Christ, even though it's not the birth of Christ, and is it bad to celebrate? And we get into these great debates, and people tend to forget that the season we're entering into is actually a pagan celebration. No different, by the way, than what I just described to you about the warnings to the children of Israel. And I'm not saying to you, hey, don't have fun with your relatives. I've always told you, for me, Christmas is a time I use it as an excuse to tell people around me in a not weird way, hey, I appreciate you, give a gift, you express love or appreciation, that's fine. But if I hear another person say Jesus is the reason for this season, you, my friend, are a pagan. You are a pagan to not understand that you call yourself a Christian and you won't even take the time to read this book to find out that Christmas, well, what's wrong with celebrating the birth of Christ? I've already gone through this. I'm not going to preach that message again. But what I'm saying to you is what makes us any different than what I just described, except that we're not offering our children to the god of Moloch. But without understanding the relevance of this, and it's quite important, because when God says something, we can read it and we can pretend as though those are all those people in antiquity and it has nothing to do with us, but actually it does. There are consequences. Now, I don't think God is going to get mad or angry for people celebrating, hear me out, celebrating brotherly love any time of the year. Genuine brotherly love, I don't think God's offended by that. What I think is just baffling to me is that, again, we have taken up practices that we call Christian. Just as these people took up practices, and I'm sure they put a halo around it and said, look, we're serving God. But in the heart, which I cannot see and only God can, is where this message must take root. So that when people say, well, can you elaborate more on the rituals and the things they did? No, there's no need to. It tells you it started out of perversion. It was driven by perversion, driven by perverse understanding, and not even turning to God. Go to the first place. Those two daughters did not stop. Forget about what Lot did. Those two daughters did not stop right there and even talk to God and say, Lord, are we alone? What would you have us to do? We're going to pray and we're going to ask you and we're going to wait on you. As remember, God actually was kind enough to, by methods chronicled in the Bible, to deliver them from the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah. The same God could have shown them that they weren't the last of humanity, that they had to take matters into their own hands. And this is, by and large, I hate to say this, it's by and large the history of the church. If you look at the inception of the Catholic Church, it was taking matters into their own hands by trying to, let's bring more people in, let's, excuse my language, let's bastardize what holidays we do have to turn them into and graft them onto the pagan celebration so that we can all do this together. and water down the very essence of what we're here to do. Again, I want to make clear, I'm not bashing on celebrating something. I told you, I use Christmas as an excuse just to tell people, I love you, I appreciate you, or whatever, that in the secular realm would kind of maybe for other people be weird, right? But when you think about it, it is the same pagan activity. It's the same mindset that says, well, if we celebrate this, add, color in your ending for you. I know for me, what I'm trying to say is that there are consequences to everything. There was a time in this country, some of you know this, I've talked about this, there was a time in this country where Christmas was outlawed. Do you know that? A couple of you do. Look it up. It'll surprise you. And it'll surprise you as to why. Because the people, the early settlers in this country, recognized that it was not Christmas. It was not the birth of Christ. Now, ultimately, listen, look at where we are now. Everywhere you go, there is Christmas decorations and Christmas music, and it's all for the benefit of the almighty dollar, right? But back then, the people were grossly offended and thought it was terrible that pagan celebrations had crept in to usurp Christianity. Now, I'm not telling you anything that I haven't talked on or delivered before, but what I am saying to you is this message becomes really important when you start to analyze actions that are outside of God's providence and consequences that follow afterwards. So just take a look. Forget about doing it at the micro level. You can do that in your own time if you haven't already. But just take a look at our country. As our country started to succumb to the pressures of worldliness and the flesh and the devil, we started to make things be okay. You get desensitized, right? You no longer recoil at seeing certain things on TV or agendas being pushed at you. Look, we've had, 20 years of being worked on ocularly by watching TV to desensitize the population, to make it so it's not so offensive, it's not so bad. There's actually nothing offensive anymore. It's all acceptable, right? Or is it? That's what I'm talking about. So don't think that the consequences don't come home to roost. God cares deeply about what He made and what He brought to this earth. And I think the biggest thing is when we stop honoring Him and stop, when I say honoring, I don't mean that Christmas is honoring Him. I'm talking about every day. And trying to find out if a practice is being conducted. Does it belong in God's program? Does it belong within my life? Is it part of walking with Him? Or have I, just like these people, gotten caught up and swept away in something that will ultimately lead to my demise and destruction in terms of the kingdom and my eternal standing? And that's what I'm asking you to reflect on today. This is a message with many tentacles to it, but it all comes back to the same thing. We heard this during COVID. We're all in this together, right? But we really are in this case. Humanity really is in this together. And this is where it gets really amazing. You get choices. You can be like Ruth, the Moabite, who said to her Israelite mother-in-law, your God will be my God. Where you go, I will go, and I will follow you. Or you can make the God of your own design and march to your own drumbeat. And God, as I said, two groups of people, God's always looking on. Now, He is not looking for you to walk perfectly, because He knows we're flawed, and He knows we're distracted, and He knows what we do. But just that which is in the heart gives enough of a quarter turn for God to enter in and do the rest. So for many of you out there who think you may have foibled one time too many, or maybe it's the reality that you've walked to your own drum, I want you to think of the beauty of what I described in the line of Moab, bringing us to a person like Ruth. And just so you know, there are no, I hate to say it, there are no redeemables notable of Ammon, except for that one king that showed favor to David's parents. Who are these people modern day? They're the people of Jordan. Surprise. That whole area is the people of Jordan. God's last word. He said, they took land that didn't belong to them. So it'll be interesting when God evens the playing field, the last days of biblical history unfolding, to see what God does with that land. Just something to think about. When everybody's busy talking about who owns what, you know, it makes it real simple. At some point, God's going to use this technique. He'll do this. Right? It's the Scott technique of clearing a desk, where everything ends up on the floor. It's clean now. Okay, you can come in, right? But make no mistake, God is still looking for what's in the heart. So for all the people out there that say, well, I might fit into the category of marching to my own drum, I've done my own thing, I want you to think about a person like Ruth. And for the rest of the people out there, they probably cannot be turned around or helped, because they still believe that their traditions, the things they do in their worship practice, are not offensive to God. Now, I'm not God, so I can't speak as God, but I can only say from what I know and from what I've presented to you today. Yes, there's a lot of evil that the people did, and they had the opportunity. God gave them the opportunity over and over and over again to make good and to basically to redirect, right? Something that got off course, and he tried to keep redirecting them, but that never took. We don't need 1,000 redirecting lessons. We just need to hear it and move in the direction of the one who said it. That's not me, that's God's word. And as we move in that direction, God, who sees the heart, who knows we're walking clusters of big mistakes. How's that? So for all those people out there wondering, I hope I've touched on some of those hard passages, but for other people, I've given you a history of a people who had chances ad nauseum, and all they had to do is listen and follow. Luckily, we have a book that outlines that, so our opportunities are a little bit more golden. All we have to do is walk by faith, not by sight, but by faith, and follow what the instructions kind of guide us for people in the past that they didn't do, that we're able to simply just look to Christ. Looking there, you will at some point see all the stuff that's been attached falls away. Clarity comes, and you realize, I don't need all this other stuff. I just need him. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.